Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got a great show for you today. Have the weeds been just popping up all over the place, like in my yard? Yes, they definitely are. And you know, I'm not going to tackle this by myself. I am joined, as always, every single week by horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Hey, Ken.
Hello, Chris. The weeds are also starting to pop up in my landscape as well.
And I'm not going to blame the fact that I've become lazy by the end of the season. It's totally their fault. They shouldn't be there, and I'm going to do something about them eventually. Maybe. I don't know. Probably not.
I'll think about it if nothing else.
Yeah, that involves like bending over and I don't know, doing stuff. That's because right now I am just enjoying the fruits of my labor from earlier in the year. I got cucumbers coming out of my ears, tomatoes, more tomatoes than I know what to do with, especially the cherry tomatoes. Why do I do this to myself every year? Cherry tomatoes. I should know better. I shouldn't plant like 10 of them. I should plant one and I will be fine. Are you doing okay, Ken, over there in your garden?
Yeah, I guess the one benefit of not necessarily procrastinating, but not getting a whole lot planted is we haven't been inundated. Although I did pick one of those reusable grocery bags full of jalapenos. So now I got to figure out what to do with all of those. So
hot sauce time. Do you guys do hot sauce?
we do hot sauce, pickled jalapenos. We've done pickled. We haven't done any hot sauce yet. So maybe we got some Scotch bonnet and other things too. So some really hot stuff. Maybe mix in with that.
Well, I know we've already kind of talked about, sort of how we control weeds in our garden. In fact, just a few weeks ago, we were talking about cover crops and how you use those to manage weeds in your garden. But fall is a good time to chat about weeds. In fact, it's the time where I often try to encourage folks to focus on some of their perennial weeds. They'll call me in the springtime and say, hey, I got all these dandelions popping up. What do I do about them? Can I spray them right now? And I say, well, yes, but if you could wait until fall, you could be more effective in whatever you might be spraying on these weeds. So today we're talking weeds in the fall. So I guess, Ken, my question to you, I mean, we know you use cover crops and all that for some of your weed control, but are there any other reasons beside maybe a bit more efficient uptake of an herbicide that we want to focus on weeds in the fall?
Yeah, so a lot of our weeds, like our perennial or some of our annuals weeds, biennial weeds, all these different types of weeds, a lot of times seed production is happening in the fall or late summer. So if we can either prevent that seed production or remove those seed heads, we can prevent those seeds being added to the seed bank and then germinating the next year, or depending on the weed, 5, 10, 15, 25 years down the road, depending on how long they can survive. So we can try to prevent some problems from happening by preventing that seed formation or preventing that from getting into the soil. Like you mentioned, herbicides for perennials that moves down into the roots a lot better. And then things like our summer or cool season annuals, winter annual weeds, whatever you want to call them, they're germinating late summer, early fall timeframe. So they're starting to grow. They're going to overwinter throughout the winter. And then in the spring, we're going to have this explosion of growth, which makes it really hard to manage them. So managing them now, again, we can prevent some of those problems right off the bat.
Mm-hmm. And as far as our summer annuals, now those are the weeds that germinated in the spring and they've grown all summer. One example I like to give is something like crabgrass, maybe even foxtail. That's another example. We often get to a point later in the season where I'm like, you know what? It's too late. There's no reason to really focus on a summer annual weed this late in the season because, especially once we get towards mid to late September, frost is coming. It's right around the corner. It's going to kill that plant. More than likely, if you haven't addressed it by mid-September, it's already dropped its seed or at least it's set its seed. So you're going to have to like pull it and bag it and get it out of there. Spraying it may not prevent that seed from dropping to the ground and germinating again next year. So I often tell folks when it comes to summer annuals and fall, eh, just try again next year. And, well, maybe some type of pre-emergent or something when we're dealing with like crabgrass or foxtail in a lawn setting. That will help to reduce that amount of weeds the following year. But for the fall, you mentioned winter annuals, which is different from summer annuals, and you described it as, and I always like to just to say that they do germinate in the fall, and then they just hang out all winter, and they do almost nothing. And I do have, I do like some winter annuals, especially the ones that turn the fields purple in the spring, and that probably is going to be your henbit. Um, there's another one called purple dead nettle that also has purpley colors to it. But really, it's not a big issue at the farmers because they'll either spray it or plow it, and they don't have to worry about it. But where I often see an issue with our winter annual weeds is in the vegetable garden because you're gardening, like I'm still gardening. I might have some cool
Mhm.
season stuff that I'm growing through November. I might have some things I'm going to plant late winter, early spring. And now I'm battling these winter annuals. So I guess, Ken, do you have any tips or advice when it comes to winter annual control? Because they do get in my way when it comes to the vegetable garden.
So this time of year, they're small. They're just germinating. So they're seedlings or they're really small and they're overwintering. They're usually little rosettes, just this kind of cluster of leaves, typically not terribly large. So going in and doing manual removal, whether that's my hand, um, if you've got hoe mount, a stirrup hoe, something like that, scuffle hoe, something, just to kind of sever that root system because they're not very big. They're not going to, like I say, they're never going to, but they're more than likely they're not going to survive that. So do it now. It's going to be a lot easier. Probably shouldn't take a whole lot of time, and again, save you that time in the spring because when it starts warming up in the spring, that they're going to start pushing a lot of growth, and management's going to get a little more difficult because they're going to be getting bigger. Um, as they're pushing up new growth, those herbicides, you can still use them, but sometimes it's a little more difficult because they're pushing out growth, and sometimes herbicides aren't quite as effective. And so, and putting down a mulch down this time of year helps smother them, or maybe even prevent them from germinating if they need sunlight, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I very often I turn to like some type of stirrup hoe or just pulling them out with my bare hands when the springtime rolls around. But getting them now, and in a vegetable garden, you could you could look and see if you could find any pre-emergent herbicides. I highly doubt there'd be anything available for vegetable gardens if you're growing crops in there this fall. So make sure you're reading those labels very carefully if you do turn towards an herbicide option, especially in those gardens, vegetable crops areas. I I will add a lot of folks will call me about chickweed, which is another type of winter annual. Very often they find it in the lawn. Now, this typically will pop up in lawns where there's been a disturbance. Someone might install a fence, or maybe, some neighbor or you spray to kill a patch of weeds somewhere in your lawn. And instead of lawn grass to fill in, it's chickweed that fills in. Or the dogs might leave a bare patch in the lawn, and what fills in? It's chickweed, which that's pretty much a major portion of my lawn right now. And so chickweed is can be a big issue. So one option you do have, because we're not dealing in a situation where we're growing edible crops, is you could use a pre-emergent lawn herbicide in the fall to prevent that germination of those seeds. But you have to make sure the label says you can seed in lawn, that it won't try to control also your Kentucky bluegrass or turf type tall fescue, whatever it is that you're going to also be seeding down. Because if you apply an herbicide and you don't also try to reestablish a lawn in that situation, well, you're just going to have something else fill in there next year. So make sure if you're doing this for lawns that you're also, fall is a great time for overseeding. But if you're using a pre-emergent herbicide, make sure that you can also overseed. So read all those labels carefully. Got a lot of reading for you this week.
Lots of homework. Um,
Exactly.
so, and then another one, type of weed, biennial weeds. So these are weeds that are germinating year one. They're growing as that rosette, again, that cluster of leaves. They'll overwinter, so they've grown a season. They'll overwinter, and that following year they'll grow some more, and then they'll shoot out that reproductive, the flowers and stuff, and reproduce. So, garlic mustard, some of the thistles would be examples of that. Burdock. Um, so managing those now in the rosette stage can prevent all those issues with that seed formation following year, again, as they're getting ready to overwinter. A lot of the energy and stuff is going down to the roots, so they can overwinter. Easier to get those herbicides in and manage them, and then prevent those problems next year. Teasel is another one. It's sometimes a biennial, was also a macrocarpic perennial. So it only blooms once, but it may take more than 1 year. So there's all kinds of variation in that as well.
Yeah, I have on my calendar. So we have on our extension website. I believe it is garlic mustard. That is one of our spotlighted invasive species that we have, and you can actually download a calendar event for October 15th to remind you to do something about your garlic mustard in the fall before it goes through that winter life cycle and just explodes next spring with seeds and spreads everywhere. Well, Ken, I think we also sort of tease this a little bit about perennials, dandelions. These perennial ones, as you described, they better systemic movement of herbicides. So fall, they're taking carbohydrates from their leaves and everywhere. They're moving them down towards the root system. Put a little bit of herbicide to go along with the ride. But when we talk about perennial type weeds, ones that people love to hate, we're talking mostly dandelions, clover, creeping Charlie. Another one would be however you want to say this, plantain or plantain. I hear it both ways. There's a couple different types of that, like narrow leaf plantain. Actually, my yard has large patches of plantain or plantain in it, and right now they're all just dust. They're kind of just they have kind of shriveled up in our dry summer weather that we've had so far. So they might resprout here once it cools off, and if we ever get some rain. But if you are controlling or spraying some type of weed that has already gone dormant or that is gone, more than likely, we don't always say always, and we never say never, but spraying an herbicide on non-living plant tissue often results in no effect. So you have to have green living tissue to absorb that chemical to then translocate it to the root system. Now that is an important part of this. Don't just spray the lawn when you don't see any weeds.
Yeah, that's an important point. And we get into our some of our invasive, our woody invasives and stuff. Once they've shed all their leaves, it becomes a lot more, depending on the type of herbicide you're using. You're using a foliar spray, there's no foliage there. It's not going to do you a whole lot of good.
Yeah. And for the longest time, I would even tell folks when it came to like bush honeysuckle control, by the time you get to winter, the leaves are off. I would say, I don't think it's a great idea to cut the stump and then do like a stump treatment of herbicide on that in the wintertime. But there are a few, looks like, studies that show that can still be an effective way to go. So if you do miss some of that, this fall, say if you're trying to control bush honeysuckle, you could still do cut stump treatments in the winter. I still think you probably wouldn't have as a great uptake of that chemical, but it is a recommendation.
Something's better than nothing.
I guess so.
Put it in that category.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Ken, I suppose switching gears ever so slightly, though still related, as we're talking about weeds, there have been some changes to some herbicides this year. And we do kind of have two instances to share with you. And the first thing One that I have dealt with a lot with people calling in and just kind of confused about. They have a lot of questions. They're not sure why their bottle of Roundup is giving different directions than it used to in the past. Is the fact that Roundup has changed. Roundup used to be almost synonymous with the active ingredient glyphosate, especially, well, in the homeowner market. And that's really what we're talking about right now is people who might buy this, I don't know what the proper term is, over-the-counter use, general use, herbicide, and spray it on a lawn or a garden or something like that. So we're talking about the homeowner market, but glyphosate is out when it comes to Roundup. And there are some new active ingredients in it, which has changed the label directions.
Yeah, I encountered that this spring. I was looking to kill off some grass to do a vegetable garden bed, and looking through the label, and usually it's on the quote unquote old Roundup. Was it 1 day after spraying, 1 day you could plant ornamentals, 3 days for vegetable crops, and there was nothing for vegetable crops, nothing ornamentals or woody plants was like 30 days. So I went back to the cover like, oh, there's no glyphosate in this anymore. So
it has changed. I guess the old label had, the old formulation, when we talk about Roundup, it had glyphosate in it. And that is the active ingredient. That's what we always tell people when they're purchasing an herbicide. Look in that it's in little tiny print all the time, but it has to be on that bottle. It's like by law required to list the active ingredient. The active ingredient is the thing that does the killing. It is the thing that is doing the control, and glyphosate is for that. They also very often would include pelargonic acid, which it's sort of like a contact, quick knockdown herbicide. And I often just say they threw that in there so that when people sprayed, made them feel like something was happening more immediately, because it would take up to 2 weeks sometimes for glyphosate to really move through that plant's tissue and kill it from its root system. So that's kind of what the pelargonic acid. It was just sort of like a little extra,
it's
little extra.
instant gratification.
That's right. That's right. We all need that.
Results within 6 hours.
Yeah. So I guess it's important to note that this is a brand decision. This is not mandated. This is voluntary by the company that makes Roundup. Was that Dow Chemical these days? I can't keep track. Bayer. Yeah, Bayer. The Bayer. And so that has been voluntary. You can still get glyphosate. Like you can go find generic brands of glyphosate. I believe. Well, I won't even say when I think the date was, but I thought it was turn of the century or 1990-ish when you started being able to manufacture a generic form of glyphosate. And back then, when Monsanto owned it, their not copyright, restriction.
Yeah.
Patent. That's when their
I
patent
think it was
ran
around,
out.
yeah, I think it was around 2000-ish.
2000
in there.
Okay.
So there's the quote unquote generic glyphosate.
Still get it.
Yeah, maybe. I think that'll a little bit will depend on where you're looking at. I think your big box stores, it may be a little more difficult. But if you're going to a nursery or somewhere that's got a little more diverse options as far as herbicides and stuff, you'll probably be able to find it. And like everything, you can find anything on the internet if you really need glyphosate.
That's right. Yep. You can always find anything you need and get on watch lists. So, I often say, you could go to local garden centers. It's pretty easy to find different things, or especially, if you have like a farm store that has like a forestry section where they might have a lot of these generic active ingredients in bulk. And so we'll still be recommending, we'll probably still have glyphosate in a lot of like extension recommendations. It's just not going to be synonymous with Roundup anymore, which I think is going to take some time and some adjustment, probably for us and for consumers.
Yeah, it's like 7 and carbaryl.
Yes.
I don't even know if 7 has carbaryl in it anymore.
I don't think it does. Yeah, it's something different now. But yeah, that's where our brain it makes that relationship because it was so common and it's so commonly used in the past.
And so Purdue extension, Purdue put an article out that was when Roundup isn't Roundup, clearing up the confusion between products. And they list some of the different formulations now. And we'll put this article in the show notes so everybody can read it for themselves. But so some of them is now triclopyr. So this is a
Auxin, yeah,
yeah,
it's like a broadleaf herbicide.
broadleaf herbicide, fluazepop, which is a grass herbicide, diquat, which is a kind of a burn down type herbicide, really quick acting, and then a mazapic, which is a little more broad spectrum. So now you've got just glyphosate. Now you've got 4 different active ingredients in this particular one they're talking about, and then they've got some for lawns. So these are all going to be specific to broadleaf. So MCPA, quinclorac, dicamba, sulfentrazone. So all of these are broadleaf, or the sulfentrazone is nutsedge. So again, you've got more mixtures now than just a single active ingredient in a lot of these.
Yeah. And I think the one that has gotten a lot of questions, it's very common for people to have used glyphosate in the past to maybe prep a landscape bed, and they might spray glyphosate in the bed area. They'll kill the grass, and then they'll come in with like shrubs and trees and other perennials and things to create a landscape bed. But now that the instructions say you have to wait 30 days for planting any type of woody material, so the question has really been like, why has that changed? And it's really, from what I've read, is the active ingredient triclopyr. Triclopyr, as Ken said, it's a broadleaf herbicide. It's really good at killing woody plants, and is very often something that might be recommended for going after like invasive species like our bush honeysuckle or autumn olive. You might use triclopyr or glyphosate. Both of them do that very well, but triclopyr is a little bit different in that it's more mobile in the soil and a bit more persistent in the soil. Whereas a glyphosate, what would happen to that is you would spray it and it would just bind to soil particles, and it really wouldn't move that much. And so long as you had sunlight, aka UV light, it would break down within a span of a few days, at least below a threshold that could hurt a woody plant. And so that's really the big change that I see a lot of people having questions about. Why can't I come in after I spray this, as Ken described, a day or two and plant my trees and shrubs like I've always done? Well, more than likely it's that triclopyr active ingredient.
Yeah. So go back to read your labels to make sure you know, depending on why you're using it and what you're going to be using it for, that you're not setting yourself up for headache and heartache down the road by planting in it too soon if you're doing a lawn or elimination to plant stuff. So I guess it's good we're getting the questions because people are reading the labels.
I know. I'm happy to get these questions because it does go to show that the folks are reading the label. But there is a one formulation of Roundup that still does contain glyphosate, and it's actually a combination of triclopyr and glyphosate, and that is their tough brush killer formulation. I think, what did they say here in the Purdue article? They call it Roundup, poison ivy, and tough brush killer. And it says, yeah, it contains both of those active ingredients, triclopyr and glyphosate, which is one that we very often recommend for those woody invasives.
All right, and then there's one more herbicide that's been in the news. That's Dacthal, or DCPA. And for this one, the EPA, and EPA is in charge of all pesticide registration in the U.S. So they say what goes and what doesn't. They have issued an emergency stop order use for Dacthal, which means you can no longer use it even if you have it. So a lot of times when they cancel registration, or they stop producing it and it's no longer for use, you can use up existing stocks. That is not the case for Dacthal. You cannot use it anymore. You have to dispose of it without using it.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think in the past it was very commonly used as a pre-emergent in lawn herbicides. When the EPA first started having an issue with Dacthal many years ago, the company actually voluntarily removed it out of a lot of their lawn herbicides. But there was still quite a lull between when their reports were due in 2016 till when the EPA finally just said, we're not going to let you sell this in 2022. And then finally they did submit reports that showed that there were issues when, especially with farm workers, where Dacthal can be used commonly in like onions, Brussels sprouts, and broccoli production. And so a lot of these farm workers, namely women, pregnant women who are exposed to this, were showing lower fetal birth weights, thyroid issues with their unborn and born children, and a lot of other kind of lifetime incurable issues. And so, in light of the information the company finally provided to EPA, and all this other evidence that they're seeing, stopping the emergency stop use, which that's something that is rarely ever used by the EPA. So it's first time in almost 40 years that they've ever had to use that.
Usually it's a phase out. So probably unlikely that people are going to have this as far as like a home gardener goes. But if you, for some reason you do, you're not allowed to use it anymore and dispose of that. Look up your, clean sweep programs or things like that in your area.
Yeah. Illinois has been doing a much better job at those clean sweep programs. At least where I'm at in Macomb, we very often now have it once a year. Usually it has happened in the spring, but yeah, you can check out where the clean sweep program will be. Perhaps, I don't know if they have their dates for 2025 yet, but at the Illinois EPA website.
And there are a couple permanent locations.
In more metro kind of areas. I think they do have some permanent ones. But us here in the rural hinterland, we gotta wait for our time. That's right, old Borgatonia. Well, that was a lot of great information about perennial weed control in the fall, annual weed control. But is it winter annual, summer annual? That's the important thing to distinguish. Then, of course, our biennials out there. And then changes to the herbicides that, at least when it comes to products like Roundup, very often can be found on a lot of shelves and a lot of garages across Illinois. And then the emergency stop use of Dacthal, which probably not in most garages, but if it is, read your product label, active ingredients, and make sure you're disposing of that properly. So yeah, lots of great information, Ken. I guess maybe I'm a bit more motivated now to go out and pull some of that Creeping Charlie that I love so much.
Yes, it's a good time to do it. And don't forget, it doesn't have to just be herbicides. You can knock some of this stuff out if it's a small patch, easy enough with your hands or a hoe, something like that. So it's possible to do it without herbicides too.
Yeah, I tolerate the weeds for the most part in my yard. I might smother them, I might pull them. Very rarely will I spray them. Most often, I will reserve that for managing some of those invasive plants, that are listed, like bush honeysuckle, like autumn olive. And I just found it in my backyard tree of heaven. And there's a big mama attached to this tree of heaven and way across the way. So I'm like, oh, great. Oh, anyway, maybe we'll talk about those invasive species later on this year.
Yeah, start looking for a spotted lanternfly on it too.
That's my scouting mechanism. There you go. Yeah. Just got to keep it from flowering.
There you go.
Well, the Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by Ken Johnson. And a special thank you to Ken for both editing and hanging out with me, talking about them fall weeds and them herbicides. Thank you, Ken.
Yes, thank you, Chris. And let's do this again next week.
Oh, we shall do this again next week. Can you believe it's September And there's so much stuff going on. So we're going to have a couple garden bites for you coming up these next few weeks. So enjoy those. We'll be right back with you the end of the month. Just me and Ken hanging around, talking about gardening. So listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing. Does it tell you recording started when I hit the button? And it says, do you want to leave?
It's got a little banner. Well, it's just this meeting is being recorded.
Okay.
My only option is okay.
It's okay. I can't stop it.